Are we heading towards no deal?
An Etonian and an Estonian walk into number 10. Not a joke, but a meeting between the Prime Minister and his Eastern European counterpart. He was there apparently to talk defence. Britain has troops in Estonia, but you can bet Brexit came up.
Well, welcome, Yuri.
And while Boris Johnson was on a charm offensive inside, outside, Michael Gove, his Minister for No Deal, was pointing the finger firmly at the EU.
We stand ready to engage with the European Union, to negotiate in good faith, to make sure that we can have a friendly relationship in the future, and we will put all our energy into making sure that we can secure that good deal. But at the moment, it's the EU that seems to be saying they're not interested. They are simply saying, no, we don't want to talk. Well, I think that's wrong and sad. It's not in Europe's interests.
But today, the Irish Prime Minister insisted Europe's only too happy to talk. Leo Varadkar knows full well the sticking point remains the Irish backstop. On a visit to Northern Ireland, the Irish PM insisted he'd hold talks with Mr Johnson with no preconditions, except, of course, this one.
Our position is that the withdrawal agreement, including the backstop, is closed, but there is always room for talks and negotiations.
That's not how the vast majority of business now sees it, though. This firm in Oxfordshire makes safety equipment and was quick to protect itself after the referendum by opening a factory in Germany, the boss even then fearing a no deal. Now he's convinced.
Where we are now, I think we're going to go down, it's every inevitability we're looking at a no deal Brexit. These are the cards on the table. They've been dealt to us and we've got to work with them.
The best hope, he now believes, is to get out and move as quickly as possible to trade talks.
When you get backed into a corner, there's only two ways you go, and you generally the best way is to try and fight out of it, and that will be by a no deal, but hopefully following up with a very quick trade arrangement with Europe afterwards. And I hope Europe very much operate that way. I think we can all sit around a table once we're through with this withdrawal agreement and then look to the future, not the past.
This is my first full bilateral visit, so
On a trip to Canada today, the Foreign Secretary Dominic stuck to the no-deal script as he made a pitch for closer ties to countries like Canada to plug any trade gap.
We hope to reach an agreement with our EU partners, but we will leave the EU in any event at the end of October. For the UK, Brexit is not just about risk management, although that's important. We want to expand our horizons and raise our level of ambitions in the world. And as part of that, we want to take our friendship with Canada and the Canadian people to the next level.
As the hardline rhetoric between the EU and the UK continues, so the chance of a no deal increases. And it's here that Boris Johnson faces yet another challenge as Tory rebels continue to work behind the scenes to find a legal mechanism to block a no deal. Some may even vote against their Prime Minister in the event of a no confidence vote. And that could in turn force a general election ahead of the Brexit deadline of October the 31st. An outcome that Boris Johnson is desperate to avoid. Siobhan Kennedy, Channel 4 News, Westminster.
Well, if the government does decide a no-deal Brexit is the best option, it faces significant challenges getting Parliament to agree. Boris Johnson's wafer-thin parliamentary majority and the opposition to such departure from many of his own MPs could force him to try and defy a vote of no confidence. He could also try to call a snap election or something radically different. Our political correspondent Paul McNamara has been looking at the choices facing Mr Johnson and his new team.
Our mission is to deliver Brexit on the 31st of October. We need to leave the EU by October the 31st. We are now committed, all of us, to leaving the European Union on October the 31st.
So we know when he wants to leave the EU, and with every day that passes, it looks more and more likely it could happen without a deal. Parliament has tried to block it time and again.
274.
But time is running out. The question now is it even possible to block no-deal Brexit? Scenario 1, rebels in Parliament. So could rebel MPs block no-deal Brexit through Parliament? We've seen attempts at this in the past, where MPs hijack a bill and put some amendments next to it. In theory, couldn't they do exactly the same when Parliament returns in September? It can only happen if there is legislation to amend, and that's unlikely to be tabled, says this constitutional expert. Even if it was, time is against them.
MPs will have to steer the legislation through the Commons and then the Lords
in a very short time against a lot of amendments and filibustering by enraged Brexiteers. It's legally possible, but it's perhaps highly unlikely.
Scenario 2, a vote of no confidence. Labour have said they will table a vote of no confidence as soon as they've got the numbers. If Boris Johnson loses that, he has 14 days to prove that he can still command the confidence of Commons. If he can't, a new majority government can be formed, possibly a government of national unity. Likely?
I'd have thought the chance of a government of national unity was very small, because it would mean Labour agreeing to serve under someone other than their elected leader, Jeremy Corbyn. Now, certainly the Corbynites wouldn't have that, and perhaps some other Labour MPs wouldn't have it either.
Scenario 3, no confidence in the PM, a general election is coming. October 31st is still the deadline. A new government would need to be in place by the end of October, so there's time to decide to plough on with no deal or ask the EU for an extension. The election then would need to take place by the 29th of October, and they take place 25 working days after being announced. So they would need to be announced by September 24th. And all this is 14 days after the vote of no confidence, so that would need to take place by the 10th, just a week after Parliament returns. There is another possibility. The noises coming out of Downing Street are that if Boris Johnson loses the vote of no confidence and 14 days pass, he could simply refuse to stand down immediately and instead choose to have a general election after October 31st and let no deal Brexit happen in the meantime, because at present that's the legal default position. But would that even be constitutional?
It would be politically disgraceful for the Prime Minister to frustrate parliamentary intervention by deliberately pitching it afterwards, but I don't think that it would be unlawful. It would be one of those things which would be politically intolerable but not illegal.
He said no deal is 1,000,000 to 1. The experts say it's verging on inevitable, but they added a caveat. Is the Prime Minister's rhetoric there to ready us for no deal, or to scare the EU into the deal he's said he's always wanted?
Paul McNamara. Well, earlier I spoke to the former Attorney General Dominic Grieve about how he thinks the House of Commons could block a no-deal Brexit. It's been reported Boris Johnson's advisor Dominic Cummings believes a no-deal Brexit is unstoppable. I started by asking Dominic Grieve why he disagrees.
He's wrong about that. It can be stopped. It can be stopped in a number of ways. They're not necessarily simple or straightforward ways. But the idea that the Prime Minister has unlimited power to crash us out on the 31st of October, whatever the House of Commons decides to do, is totally mistaken and indeed a fantasy idea. It's just not the case.
How can it be stopped then?
The idea that he could just sit back and say, I won't cooperate, I won't do anything and I'm not going to resign, is fanciful. He would have to resign, and if he didn't resign and there was an alternative government presented which had the support of the House of Commons, in extremis, the Queen would have to sack him.
Would you really revert to that, to bringing in the monarch to remove a Prime Minister?
Well, I've no desire to see the Queen brought into politics. It's a completely invidious position, but we are ultimately in this country a constitutional monarchy. The Queen isn't a decorative extra. She actually has a number of key reserved powers, and one of them is the prerogative of appointing Prime Ministers, and also getting rid of Prime Ministers who no longer have the support of the House of Commons. It's an extraordinary suggestion that's come out of number 10 Downing Street, that the Prime Minister who lost the vote of confidence simply carries on until a general election which he decides to hold on a particular date, when in fact the Fixed Term Parliament Act provides a contrary mechanism, and in furthermore one which is completely in keeping with our constitutional tradition which predates it.
What would be to stop Boris Johnson? Suppose the period of no confidence takes place sometime around the middle or end of September. Wouldn't it be perfectly reasonable for him to say, OK, we'll have a general election in 6 weeks' time after a proper campaign, and that will be in the beginning of November?
Well, that's a separate issue. If a motion of no confidence leads to no new administration being created, then undoubtedly there's then a general election, And the possibility exists that Boris Johnson could try to crash us out of the EU in the middle of the general election campaign. I think the Cabinet Secretary would point out to him that he is merely a caretaker Prime Minister, and therefore acting in this way is grossly improper in accordance with our Constitution. But I do accept that there's probably very little to prevent him doing it.
Isn't there a grave danger from your point of view, though, that if you succeed in stopping a no-deal Brexit through a parliamentary route, what you will end up with is Nigel Farage in power?
I've no idea who will end up in power at the end of this rather crazy period in our political history. Indeed, in many ways, I'm afraid that Boris Johnson's government is now a manifestation of a particular kind of extremism, and that worries me very much indeed.
You have just compared Boris Johnson's government to a form of extremist government. I mean, they would say that's really irresponsible talk. It's the kind of divisive talk that is making politics worse. Because at the end of the day, Boris Johnson is a Conservative. He's a reasonably liberal Conservative on all sorts of matters. He's not an extremist by any traditional description of that word.
Well, he's not behaving in a very Conservative way, is he? I mean, for starters, he's appointed as his principal advisor an individual, Mr. Cummings, whose contempt for the House of Commons is so great that when he was summoned to give evidence before a Commons committee, rather an important thing to happen, simply didn't turn up, and then finds himself held in contempt of the House of Commons, and quite rightly. And incidentally, Boris Johnson didn't argue against that happening, and yet he's quite happy to put such an individual on the public payroll and to allow him to spout out what appears to be a series of diatribes against anybody who disagrees with him. That doesn't sound very Conservative to me at all.
Dominic Grieve, thank you very much.
That was Dominic Grieve speaking via the internet from his holiday earlier. So can he and other Conservatives keen to stop a no deal rely on support from Labour? A little earlier, I spoke to the Shadow Business Secretary, Rebecca Long-Bailey, and I asked her if she conceded that there was nothing the opposition could do to stop a no deal.
We would contest that. We think that there are legal arguments within the Fixed-Term Parliament Act that would give other options, or put other options on the table, as it were, to parliamentarians.
You'd contest that in the courts or in Parliament or both?
Well, there are a number of tactical options that we're certainly looking at, and I wouldn't want to determine which particular options we'd choose, because we've got the 2 weeks when we get back in September, which will be quite a ferociously active period within Parliament for all across Parliament, I think.
But you're convinced that you could, in some way, block a no-deal Brexit and block a Prime Minister defying a vote of no confidence?
We'll try all of the options that are available to us. What has been clear throughout the chaos that we've seen over the last 2 years is that there is no parliamentary majority in support of a no-deal Brexit, and all politicians of all colours will be working together to make sure that that does not happen.
Well, that's interesting you put it like that. Would you, for example, consider working with other politicians in a kind of government of national unity?
We're quite clear that we're happy to collaborate on a cross-party basis, but we wouldn't countenance a national government of unity, as it were, because we think that we need to have a clear majority for a government in Parliament, and that's why we're calling for a general election. And what we don't want is a national unity government that gives Boris some sort of get-out-of-jail-free card, so as soon as Brexit's been sorted out, he can sail back in without any problems at all, without a sufficient parliamentary majority.
What if that government of national unity was for a temporary period led by Yvette Cooper, Heidi Allen, Joe Swinson, anybody who you could command the respect of the House?
Well, it would be questionable whether Boris would countenance that, but we want a Labour majority and a Labour government.
So if you do get that general election that you want, am I right in thinking that Labour would, as an entire party, be unequivocally Remain?
We have a meeting called a Clause 5 meeting where all of the relevant affiliates and stakeholders within the Labour Party come together to determine what our final position would be, and we have a discussion and come to a consensus about that. Well, you know, all along I've supported the party's position that we need to have a credible Brexit deal on the table, and we need to negotiate with the EU to ensure that we get that deal. In terms of what I would like to see in the future, I need to determine, as the party does, where we are in the Brexit process, and ultimately it will be a decision that will be taken to put our economy and our families and our working people in Britain first.
But your policy on Brexit could be further sitting on the fence at an election.
Well, it will be determined based on the current Brexit process at the time. It certainly won't be a case of fence-sitting. It will be one that delivers the best economic outcome for Britain.
Do you accept the charge that if we do crash out of the EU without a deal, that Jeremy Corbyn's lack of leadership on Brexit would be partly to blame?
No, I think Jeremy has been a very strong leader on Brexit. He's been probably the only leader in Westminster who's tried to bring different spheres of the country together.
But he's fudged it. I mean, that's not leadership, is it? He's fudged it. You never know from one moment to the next what his policy is.
No, it's not a fudge. He's been very, very careful in making sure that he represents as many viewpoints as he possibly can, but ultimately providing policy decisions that protect our economy going forward.
Rebecca Long-Bailey. Well, that's those who oppose a no-deal Brexit. What about those who support Boris Johnson's pledge to leave on the 31st of October, do or die? I'm joined now by Stephen Booth from the think tank Open Europe. So you think no deal can't be stopped?
No, no one knows that. We'll see what Parliament does. Both sides think they're right. The government is convinced that it can push through no deal without being stopped, and there are those in Parliament that we've heard from just now that think they can. I think the question is, are there the mechanisms available to stop a no deal, particularly if, say, a national government of unity is required and the Labour Party is saying it won't play ball. So I'd question whether the mechanisms are there to stop it.
Well, so do you agree with these ideas being attributed to Dominic Cummings, that even if there was a vote of no confidence, Boris Johnson should schedule the election for after October the 31st and just sit it out?
Well, that's not for me to decide. I think what I would say is that we have a parliament, 80% of which of the MPs voted to trigger Article 50. Article 50 is a page long. It is very clear what happens if you fail to agree a deal, you leave without a deal.
But do you think
Parliament has so far rejected 3 opportunities to vote for the deal. So I think he would argue, surely, that the Parliament has implicitly set in train the process of no deal.
I mean, Dominic Grieve, you heard there, said in that scenario, the Queen would have to sack him. Is that credible?
Well, I don't know. I think we were clearly in completely unprecedented times, and I think by the time the Queen gets involved, we're clearly in desperate straits. I think what I would say...
But I mean, the question is, what does constitutional monarchy mean in that scenario? He says, we are a constitutional monarchy. The Queen is not just a decorative extra. Is it really credible that the Queen could decide, under God alone knows whose advice, to actually intervene and sack the Prime Minister because he no longer commands the support of the House of Commons?
Potentially. But I think the bigger issue here is that we've got sort of Parliament at odds with a referendum decision. And people like Dominic Grieve would have limited sympathy from myself, because he voted to trigger this process. He voted to trigger Article 50 and has voted 3 times against a deal which would stop a no-deal Brexit. And the question is, what is the alternative? Is it simply, again, extending just so we put off the decision? And I think the risk is that Parliament is seen to be running away from making a decision. It hasn't revoked Article 50, which is also an option open to it. There doesn't appear to be a majority in favour of that either. So what Parliament is saying to the people is that we don't want to make a decision.
So what do you make of this sort of Parliament versus the people narrative that is clearly being sort of stoked by the number 10 team?
Well, I think it's quite an easy script for them to write. As I said, 80% of the Parliament in 2017 voted to trigger Article 50. Presented with a deal, Parliament has on 3 times voted against that. And yes, that's partly to do with 30 or so Brexiteers for who no deal was ever going to be good enough. But 140 MPs, a lot of which are Labour Party MPs, voted to trigger Article 50, but then refused to back a deal.
And do you think there's anything Boris Johnson can do now to bring his rebels around?
In order to back him on no deal?
Yes.
I think that looks quite difficult. I think people like Dominic Grieve are clearly set on their course of action.
But how many people like him do you think there are?
Well, there only needs to be 2 or 3. His majority is vanishingly small. I guess what you also presented in your programme is that there also is the potential for Boris Johnson at the very last minute to present a deal to Parliament and say, look, there is a deal. It's a deal or revoke, or a deal or no deal. There are still these options to be presented. But I think what is key is that Parliament does have to be presented with a binary choice at some point, because there have always been 3 options: remain in the EU, leave with a deal, or leave without a deal. And Parliament has so far spent 3.5 years simply trying to avoid that choice. And I think we have to get to a point where one of those options is knocked out and Parliament makes a decision and the country can move on.